This is a brief but hopefully not too shallow review of an important new book titled The Other Slavery. As you'd guess from the title, it's about the enslavement of indigenous Americans, Native Americans, American Indians, the native people who were present in the Caribbean before the arrival of Columbus, the people who were present in North and South America before the arrival of British, French, and Spanish conquerors, imperialists, settlers, whatever you want to say. However, in talking this over with my girlfriend Melissa before filming this video, I pointed out to her that in my own life, I actually experienced a very strange parallel history in that I, for many years, was researching politics of Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. The people of modern Thailand are intensely aware that they are not the indigenous people of Thailand. They're aware of their own very strange history of settlement and colonialism, of the creation of Thailand, and that other peoples, who are generally called the Mon Khmer peoples, were resident there before the arrivals of the Thai in a militaristic march from north to south that conquered and enslaved the native peoples. And one of the things that was really striking to me in dealing with, researching, and discussing this history over many years with Thai, Lao, and Cambodian people, but also other foreign scholars, other white Westerners who were there researching history or working in museums or doing archaeology or whatever they were doing, it always struck me that it was the white Westerners who really found this psychologically disturbing. And that the people of Thailand were really quite comfortable with. People of Laos were totally comfortable with, including government officials in high positions I spoke to and so on. None of them seemed to be bothered by that idea, and they all seemed to have a very down-to-earth attitude towards the historical reality of slavery. And I think I can say that's because in their culture it was never really taboo. This has a lot to do with Buddhism, has a lot to do with the contrast between how their civilization developed and how ours did, and even how slavery was abolished in their culture as opposed to how slavery was abolished in ours. I can remember my boss, a Laotian, member of the Communist Party, fairly high placed in one of my workplaces. I can remember him talking about how his own grandmother had direct memories of slavery and rape, of women being raped and enslaved and so on. There were other places closer to the border with Myanmar where there was still the living memory of women's faces being tattooed to avoid being taken captive, enslaved, turned into sex slaves or what have you. So that's interesting because for the most part, it's not really in their formal written school curriculum. And by the way, in Laos especially, I really did take the time to study what was and wasn't in school textbooks. In Thailand, I was looking more at what was in university level history textbooks, but in both countries, it was interesting how history was being taught, how history was to some extent overlapping with propaganda. So this new book about the history of slavery in the New World, New France, New Spain, North America, South America, in many ways, exactly why it is so powerful is the challenge it poses to propaganda. And it doesn't just challenge what you may be presuming to be the kind of propaganda of, say, the 1950s or even the 1980s. It challenges currently prevalent, currently popular propaganda notions. It challenges the notion that the indigenous peoples of the New World just died away passively due to disease and not due to a process of being actively extirpated from their land, hunted down, literally put in chains, literally being forced to march at the point of a spear huge distances with no proper food and water. And then they died of disease. I mean, in many cases, this goes through really specific case studies and details, but you're talking about huge numbers of indigenous peoples dying in Mexico City, but they were dying there after they were enslaved and put on a death march. So yes, disease finished them off, but to pretend that this is just due to the microorganisms in a vacuum is really dishonest, is really a form of propaganda. So that's one type of still currently prevalent, still popular propaganda that's profoundly challenged by this book. I'd also say that this book challenges, the narrative of heroic indigenous resistance. Really being honest with yourself about the evidence presented in this book shows the extent to which, in history, there are victors and there are victims. And that victimization can be absolute. That people, they weren't just deprived of their lives and their land and their language and their culture. They weren't just deprived of their religion. They were very literally put in chains and raped into oblivion until they ceased to exist. And even some of the peoples who heroically and tragically stood up against the Spanish, fought against the Spanish, and won. Sometimes they won for 50 years, and sometimes they won for 100 years. They also eventually, in the passage of centuries, have ceased to exist. In some cases, the quote-unquote heroes of the resistance in that sense, the groups that were relatively successful in a military sense in resisting Spanish conquest and Spanish enslavement, today we have no record of what their language was. We're only vaguely aware of where they lived within Mexico. There's no trace of their material culture or existence. The only records we have are the written descriptions of their wars with the Spanish, their wars precisely to resist being enslaved and being forced to work in gold mines, so on and so forth. So it is an absolutely tragic history. The significance of this book now is, without being too corny, is to open a new chapter, both in scholarship and in popular awareness of the issue. There are several different chapters of this book that I can imagine easily adapting to be high school history lessons, like just to take one chapter and present it to students. There are several that could be assigned readings in a university level course and could serve very well for that. The book as a whole is set up chronologically and also sort of drifts geographically. So as we move forward in history, the focus of the book also moves north. Starting in the Caribbean, in Haiti, with the arrival of Christopher Columbus. There's a lot of very good research here about the first 50 years that had an unbelievable calamitous result in terms of wiping out native populations and the role of slavery in that. I mean, this is not just genocide. The point is understanding slavery as genocide and genocide as slavery in this context as never before. And that the enslavement and marketing, there's no better word, of native people as slaves, that this really was a continent-spanning phenomenon in its own right that has to be studied as something of tremendous importance, and it can't be made into a footnote after African-American slavery, that there's this African narrative of Africans being exported to the New World, and then have a footnote saying, oh yeah, and also there were some indigenous people. No. This is really a story. It needs to be understood, needs to be taught in its own right. So, starting with Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean, we then drift forward century by century and north through the golden age, literally, of gold mining and then silver mining in central Mexico, up into New Mexico, and then up into Utah. And right from the introduction of the book, you get a sense of the thematic focus and interest of the book. And those three stories the book tells quite well. We get a sense of the early history in the Caribbean, there's a middle period centered in Mexico, and then we get into later history, a lot of information on New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, that area. But that is about it. So, obviously, another book could be written, another book should be written. Several sequels can easily be imagined, covering further areas geographically, and also covering some of the later centuries in greater detail. The rich and dense portions of the book are the portions that have written evidence in Spanish in archives that the author works from. So by contrast, this author is not presenting evidence from French language archives. There were just a couple of tantalizing mentions of how this history connects to Louisiana and Quebec. There's a fascinating single sentence mention of the huge number of Apaches who ended up in Quebec. So the Apache are indigenous to the far south of the United States, basically desert, from my desert and whatever, dry, hot climate. And they were enslaved, sold to Louisiana, and then sent north to work in Quebec. So I know stories from my own research of the opposite. I know about Korean Ojibwe people in Canada who were enslaved and sent to work on sugarcane farms in the Caribbean. So again, this continent-spanning, culture-crushing, economy of how slaves, how free people were turned into slaves, and then those slaves were marketed and exported, even within the New World. Sorry, but coming back to the issue of documentary evidence, the other phenomenon which my girlfriend found especially striking was the export of these slaves back to Europe. So, for example, from the Caribbean, slaves being sent back to Spain, old Spain in Europe, and living out their lives as slaves there. And ultimately, their descendants are still alive in Spain today. So there's some people in Spain who, whether they know it or not, have Aboriginal blood from North America. It's a fascinating history. But those slaves, the ones that were taken back to Spain, for example, left us good written records. And that's where this book is strong. And as it moves forward in history, it actually gets weaker. So early on, we get a very robust sense decade by decade, not just century by century, of the history as it unfolds. And then unfortunately, as we come closer to the 19th century and 20th century, even really 18th century, if I'm being honest, as we move forward century by century, it really devolves into a set of isolated anecdotes, of peculiar case studies that he happened to have some documentary evidence for, but with no further extrapolations or generalizations. Now, I can imagine, I used to work in the publishing industry myself. I kind of got the feeling that the author was working against the deadline. This isn't, academic research, or this isn't a nationally funded study with unlimited time and resources. So simply put, some chapters of the book are stronger than others. If you are a high school teacher or university professor in Utah, the sections on Utah are fabulous, for example. New Mexico, or just northern Mexico, incredibly powerful, incredibly well researched. But there's a lot more of North and South America. There's a lot more even of the Caribbean. There's a lot more history to tell here. And indeed, there's more work to be done in archives. For example, Portuguese, French, and even English. That this is largely based on Spanish sources. So, in conclusion, I feel like a lot of people today want to believe in a myth of a righteous and continuous indigenous cultural tradition that stood up against European aggression, and that's still standing. And that's not true. And that myth is really just as insidious as the old-fashioned myth from maybe the 1950s of a kind of glorious European colonial expansion, a kind of openly, nakedly pro-imperialist national myth, in that both of them really let us close our eyes to the unbelievably brutal reality of what the enslavement of the indigenous peoples of North America was. It absolutely was, above all else, about sex slavery. It absolutely was. And even the economics of that are dealt with in this book again and again, decade by decade and century by century. Even in the periods where the silver mines are most intensely demanding physically strong adult male laborers, even then, it's young females, young good-looking females that are worth 3 times as much as men and so on. And it's young females being sold either to become household slaves, where they did more than just mop the floor and more than just, breastfeed other people's kids. They were, this was really a form of sexual peonage, sexual exploitation, which is, found throughout the whole book. In this way, the so-called mestizo identity of Mexico was created. The ethnically mixed reality of who Mexicans are today, and their indigenous people, indigenous languages disappeared. So now, of course, this is not to say that the history of Utah or Colorado are better. On the contrary, we get the sense that the total disappearance of any kind of indigenous people and language in large parts of the United States may be even worse. But as I say, we live in an era where people want to set aside a victim narrative, and they want to create a morally uplifting story of Native heroism. And that is not the story this book tells. This is a book that leads us to ask a lot of the right questions. It leads us to question a lot of politically convenient half-truths that some of us have grown up with, or some of us, like myself, encountered really at an elite level of academic teaching. I didn't learn this stuff when I was a kid. I learned it as a fully grown adult, reading peer-reviewed, respectable sources. But still, it leads us to ask those questions. But it is really the first book, and not the last book in English, on these questions. And it does not, as yet, have all the answers. Ladies and gentlemen, The Other Slavery, look it up.